From Wakefield, it's the Nolan Car Night Show, inviting you to join Nolan and his guest this week, Andrew Nicholls, to the show. And now, ladies and gentlemen, here's Nolan.
After the whole scenario overlapping with Mickey, you of course, as you mentioned, George Carlin is one of the successful people you had written with or worked for as well. There is a long list of people that you and Darryl went through in terms of getting to work on the Tonight Show. Your first manager, I forget what his name is.
Ted Ziegler, the great Ted Ziegler.
Yeah, Ted Ziegler. Then I think Jackie Kahane was one. Then you joined an agency. Then eventually the third assistant musical director for Johnny Carson's Tonight Show. I forget what her first name was. Shelley Cohen.
We had been turned down everywhere for the Tonight Show by our managers and by our agents who said, "Stop asking us. We can't submit you." And then our manager just happened to know the third, Shelley Cohen, the third assistant band leader, who said, "Hey, Ted, don't you manage some writers? I think they just fired some guys." And that's how we got in. And the same material that everybody had told us wasn't strong enough is what got us hired.
Well, I'm curious about that though, because at some point when one door closes, and I think someone like myself, maybe one door closes and you get mad, you get ticked off, say, "Screw this, I'm not doing this anymore. I'm going to the next thing." But you and Darryl both stuck with it and went to the next person, to the next person. So at any point during that experience, were there doubts of not wanting to go further and continue to for us to get this situation?
No. And there was never the cinematic, oh, screw this, damn, what a terrible career. We never were that serious with each other. I mean, we were always, if something terrible would happen, we'd look at each other and go, wow. And that was about it. And then laugh about it. Because we knew there'd be something after this. I mean, the show we were working on might not be going. We were in the middle of a dinner to celebrate a show we sold in 2012 or 13. And at the dinner in Canada on location, the head of the network said she had some changes she wanted to make. And got our champagne and our expensive Chateaubriand, and she wanted to lose the main character. And so we're like, with the drink halfway to our mouths, we all looked at each other, and we had a clause which she didn't know that said we could walk. And so rather than curse everybody, we just thanked her. She paid the bill, and we got up and flew home. We never had that. We were always amusing each other and just walking. It seemed like decades, but there was 7 or 8 years where we would be, in our very cold apartments. And I would come over to Darryl's and he'd turn up the heat a little bit and put some tea on, and we'd sit there with our coats still on. And we were writing for a radio show where we had to sell, 10 jokes a day, for example, to make our rent. And we would just say, okay, let's start and look at the paper, what's new, and then try the writing stuff. But even when it got really bad, we tended to just laugh. There was never any horrible quitting moment. There was tension. I mean, we had a really bad time writing for Faye Dunaway, for example, on a series we did for her. But it was like looking at each other as we crossed in the hallway and just like, I don't know, it was very lighthearted, even through the despair.
There was a moment in which I found this story very fascinating and sort of, mainly funny in more ways than other, on the Johnny Carson podcast, where you talked about how Darryl made some joke about Geraldo's mishaps with the Al Capone scenario, and Johnny laughed at the joke. In a scenario like that, you're sitting with a guy who holds a lot of value, not just professionally, but also, I guess, socially in the world of comedy in Los Angeles and California. Can be a nerve-wracking scenario sitting with someone of his magnitude. For Darryl to just make that joke and Johnny to laugh about that, did you both now you're somehow in the scenario?
That was in our interview to see if we would get the job. I mean, the material we had written went to the head writer, who gave it to Johnny and said, "How about these guys?" And he said, "Yeah, let me meet them." I mean, I guess you had to make sure that you weren't too unsightly or something. So we were 26, 27 years old, and we went and met the producer first, Fred DeCordova, and he took us on this little golf cart, what seemed like a mile, to Johnny's secret little hidden studio office. And along the way, Fred was talking to us and saying, "Don't be nervous. It'll be absolutely okay. Mr. Carson may be a terrifying figure who could end your careers with a snap of the fingers, but don't be intimidated. And if you've ever worked for any of his enemies, such as Alan Thicke or Joan Rivers," both of whom we had written for, he says, if he asks you, don't lie about it. And so he gave us this unpep talk. And then we sat on a couch, and Johnny sat across from us, and he was rolling a coin, practicing his little magic tricks and just making chit chat. And then he was missing some
Yeah.
papers or something. And, he said, where do they go? Where are they? And Darryl said something like, oh, I think they're in Al Capone's vault. And so it had been opened the week before with a huge fanfare and a 1-hour TV special, and it was empty. And so he laughed at that. And I think maybe that's partly the lock that got us in. I remember looking at his shoes, and I remember looking at the books on the shelf and realizing how many of the books he had about showbiz I had and had read, because I would read everything I could find about how people got successful.
Sure.
Like you find a writer, or whether it's Stephen Sondheim, a songwriter, or George Kaufman or Moss Hart, and read their biography. And so they all starved. We were starving. I was starving. I had no talent. Then I sold something. All of a sudden, I was the toast of Broadway. And I just keep reading these over and over, like thinking that maybe I would absorb something. And I'm looking at the shelf, and there's that one. He's got Act One. He's got the Kaufman book. He's got Here's to the Friars. They say when you're in a car accident, time slows down. There are other moments too.
Yeah,
It's like,
I'm sure that was one of them as well.
time seems to go like this, and you just are capable of taking in all the terror and all the possibilities. And anyway, he just said at the end, well, great meeting you guys. And we walked out not knowing any more than we had when we walked in. I mean, we didn't get the phone call until that night. And we went out and celebrated in a hot tub that was installed in Darryl and Judith's house. We were so loud, apparently the neighbors started calling, but I don't remember that.
I want to talk about Fred, a guy who had a lot of power besides Johnny in terms of what went on with the show and who got on. And as you just said, a very scary figure to some aspects that could terrorize people to some aspect. For a guy like himself who had been part of that show for so many years, regardless of the success of the program, that being the first sort of level you have to go through and deal with, what was that like as a young person and new person in the writing world?
We were irreverent with Fred from the beginning. Rather than being cowed by him, we would insult him in small ways, and he was very much, if you've seen Larry Sanders, he was very much the Tambor character, the Rip Torn character, the insulting producer. And so we got just thinly saved from being fired one time, and got him some cigars. Actually, went to Canada and got him some Cuban cigars, and actually signed them from the Men They Couldn't Hang. But he called me up because he just read some stuff we wrote after the head writer had tried to dump us, and he said, I am making a call in the odd possibility that you may have acquired other employment since we canned your asses. And I said, no, we don't have anything much. He said, well, then consider this an offer. Should you be so disposed, and are you not currently so inebriated by the recent news that you're unable to understand me, to please come in on Monday, and if you could, be more prompt than you usually are. And I said, sure, this was but it's going to be our last day. And that was the way we joked around with each other. He was terrifying. He'd be sitting in the office, and the phone call would come. It's Danny Simon, or it's Neil Simon. And he would say, excuse me, gentlemen, I have a real writer. And then just like shut you out of the room. But there's some scatological Fredisms that I won't bother you with. But anyway, everybody managed to get a few digs in at him. And when you did, that stone face cracked a little, and you could see him. Yeah, he'd done the Burns and Allen show. He had done the Jack Benny show. He
was born what the beginning of the 1900s.
I don't know. He was probably 80 when no, he wasn't in his 80s yet when we started. He crept into his 80s because we would do jokes. We would in fact do whole bits for the show. We would pitch to Johnny, how about we do This Is Your Life, Fred DeCordova. We can have Lincoln come on and talk about babysitting and stuff like that. And he said certainly. And Fred was always up for that, just as as Ed McMahon was about being fat and drunk, and about Severinsen was about being brighter dressed than the average pinata. And it was after the terror of the first few years got by, and after that first head writer was relieved of his position, it became fun. Very, very high pressure, terrifying fun.
Sure. Well, by the time you joined him, he'd nearly been on television for a quarter of a century, and there are others who were younger than him: David Letterman, a generation below him, Joan Rivers, to an extent as well, amongst many others as well, and not as much as nowadays where people get a show left and right. For you, writing from at that point in his career, compared to being just a writer or then the head writer, how much did you want to help him stay with the current times and be new and fresh instead of maybe being stale if he ever was that, which he probably wasn't?
We probably would have liked to change him and change the show a little more than we were able to. We were all big fans of Letterman, including all the staff of the writers, but also Johnny himself, who also maybe wished he could have done more than he did in the direction of Letterman, putting a monkey on the camera's back, having the can. But we didn't have Hal Gurney directing. We had Bobby Quinn, who had been on the show since the beginning and was a slow walking, old fashioned, cigarette smoking kind of guy. And, what if we take a camera? And he's like, no, we can't take a camera. Let's shoot it here in the studio. So it was very hard to get him to be adventurous. We did when he first told us that we weren't being fired along with everyone else. People have been leaving all day, screaming and crying and taking their coats and packing stuff into boxes. And he called us down, and we figured it was it for us too. He'd just been through the Writers Guild strike of '88, enjoyed it, and was in a bad mood. And he called us in and said, and Fred came out of the office and said, "Gentlemen, it's not bad news." And he said, "I want you to stay on. Any suggestions you got for me?" Well, the fax had come in a year or two before, and we hadn't been using it. And he was still driving in his Corvette and getting the material he was going to do that night as he walked in. I said, there's no reason we can't get a little further ahead than we are. If we're going to do a sketch on Friday, we should be able to eventually work up to be getting you the sketch a week, maybe even 2 weeks before. And if the stuff that doesn't work, let's not find out on the stage. Let's find out when you read it and say it doesn't. Cross it out and then bring it in and hand us the fax pages. And they got him a better fax machine too. They went from a thermal fax to a plain paper fax so that his markups wouldn't get smudged. And he liked that idea. And I think he suggested that we start meeting more often, at his house. And that kept up. He asked us if there were any writers who'd been let go. We thought she'd come back, and we brought in Tom Finnegan, Bob Smith, the brilliant Bob Dolan Smith, the brilliant Tom Finnegan, and some other people who had been there and left unfairly, we thought, and remade the thing. It was still terrifying, but slowly we began to get the encouragement that, okay, he's willing to change a few things. And so when we went to the Monday meetings, I always had a pitch book, and we would meet for breakfast beforehand to prepare what we were going to pitch, all of us, and dressed better than any writers are ever dressed, and then go out to his tennis court. And he was usually just in tennis shorts and, would give us some orange juice and say, "What do you got?" And I tried to pull him towards a little more stuff he'd never done before. He could always say, "Let's do Karnak," or "Let's do Stump the Band," or, "We haven't done Turbo in a year. Let's do that again." But that just seemed too easy. We knew the files, we knew the material, and we just started getting more ideas for newer and different things that he could do that wouldn't be too uncomfortable. Sometimes we overshot the mark. We had sketches that Bobby refused to shoot, including one that's on my website called the Limerick Bank Robbery sketch, which I always thought would be really good. It was a holdup with cops and the car and a shootout and just that cliche thing, but everything was in Limerick, Ireland. Everything was a limerick, all the dialogue. And he said, "We'll give it to Bobby, see what he thinks." And Bobby said, "I don't know how to shoot it." And that was that. And we did a tongue twister sketch, which is also on my website, which is an accountant has been called in to audit Tongue Twister magazine. And he was pretty game to do it. And I thought that was going to be really cool. That would be one of those year-end sketches, because it involved recitations of things that were almost impossible. He was so good at cue cards. But he called us down to the office a week or two before and said, "I don't know that I can find anybody to play the other parts in this." We thought Betty White would have been really good. She was really sharp. There were a number of people, I thought. And he said, "Do you really expect anyone, even me, to be able to do this?" And he took a page and he did it flawlessly. Wow. I couldn't read it flawlessly. And then he put it down. And I said, "No, you're right. Probably not." And that was it. But we kept pushing. We got him to do the Weasel's Choice Awards, where the Weasel ran down the ramp and picked the Oscar winners. I mean, we were meeting him in person. So he wasn't just getting pages and going, "Weasel's Choice Awards." It was us being able to put all the body language into it, which is something previous writers hadn't had. He was getting the monologue the same way he always had, on paper only. But for sketches or for anything that involved getting into a costume or flinging him into a barrel of pudding or anything. We could be there, and he had 5 or 6 writers laughing at it and pitching in ideas. Oh, you know what you could do? You know what you could do? And then he'd get involved. I mean, he'd been a writer for the Red Skelton Show.
Sure.
He hadn't done anything for a long time, but he also knew what he was capable of, what he found funny about current culture. And so we would slip in things the way he slipped them in the monologue. We would say, you've probably seen, something you probably hadn't seen, and talk about it for a little while, and then say, what if we do something about that? Or, I'm sure you've seen the new Maxwell House jar. Have you noticed how much this guy looks like Mike Dukakis, who's running for president? We were wondering, could you do other people's faces on other things? Like, who's the Bip the Michelin Man based on? And who is the Brawny Towel Man originally? And so he could say, even though he'd never seen the jar, probably because someone else made his coffee, we could ease him gradually. Sure. He was 65, I think, and so we were in our late 20s, and the other writers were all in their 30s. We just slowly try and make him aware of things. Got him to do something with the first sampler, the first audio sampler on stage, and and also, if we thought he wasn't going to believe us, I could bring in magazines and say, look at this, they got checkouts now. The checkout's actually going to say the name of what you buy. It's going to say tomatoes, $1.50, or cucumber. Or I said, you could put food in a special order that when it's scanned, it could say sentences. I'm not sure what they are, but I bet that could be good. So introducing him to things that I don't know what he read. I know he read the guide, because we would see it with everything he was going to watch crossed out and circled. He watched a lot of TV, but I don't know what else. He was familiar with, scientific. He was really good on science, on space telescopes. So we would always hit that and try and do a Carl Sagan sketch when we could. So that's the long-winded answer to dragging a performer who's 40 years older than you.
Sure. Now, I want to ask you this, one of the last few questions I want to ask, and I take a quick break quickly. With working with Johnny, that's what, an hour and a half time slot for a show. So there's a lot of space to work with, I would think, whereas an animation program, 15 to 20 minutes. So in that aspect, going from the Tonight Show and all the other similar programs you had written for to then animation, how much of a restraint was on you to not go full out creative, fleshing out the full story? Were you more invested in that opportunity now?
We did tend to write long. And if you write long for late night, or if you write long, even for sitcoms, there's a lot of people to rein you in, to call you back and say, this is 40 pages, we top out at 38 and then we cut a minute. So we went through sitcoms, which we started in 91. And by 2000, we were doing animation, Jimmy Neutron, Fairly Odd Parents, Pelswick on Nickelodeon. And between the two, I think we had gotten, I hope, I was always able to cut really well. Darryl would always be the one to say, let's just see it in rehearsal. And so he wanted to hear what 30 people laughing, all right, that died. So he would know. And I would think, you just can't give them a long script. It's going to feel wrong. Animation, yeah. So we actually worked on shows where the scripts were 10 pages, 10 or 12 pages. And so that plays out to 12 and a half minutes. Jimmy Neutron was quarter hours. So those were, it was 16 pages, but you knew you were going to lose something. And it's the lesson of having stuff cut every week that you like, because the only thing you can cut is jokes. You can't cut setup. You can't cut character. You can't lose a whole character. They got a contract. Everyone wants to see Jimmy's dad because he's can't cut that. Oh, here's something we could lose. Oh, that's my favorite joke. After a while, that burns itself inside you and you stop writing long. And I think we've done 430 or so animated episodes. And I think we're pretty good at writing to time now. But it's so hard when you've got a lot of ideas, or you've got a big, let's do Jaws. It's got so many great scenes. How do you write that in 10 pages? Yeah, I will probably never really get the hang of it. My wife's a novelist and she writes, 1,000 pages and cuts it to 300.
You mentioned a few of the programs you worked on, Jimmy Neutron, Fairly Odd Parents. I think you also worked on George the Jungle a while ago as well. Johnny Carson, of course, for not just one generation, but for a few generations, was the cornerstone of their life, not just on television. So for you to work on a lot of these animated programs that were the cornerstones for people of my generation's life, did that have an impact on you looking back on those programs that you'd worked on?
Not during the working on, but nowadays in a cab.
Yeah.
Someone say, "Oh, you're a writer, huh? What did you write?" And I just say, "How old are you?" And then I can pick something that they would have known in their childhood, because at the time everything starts out great.
Sure.
Jimmy Neutron, Gerald McBoing Boing, Monster Buster Club, Will and DeWitt, Walter and Tandoori. How many of these have you heard of? But you go into them with the same energy, and you don't know where they're going to go. Sometimes, if the studio's behind it, and we did Witch for Disney, which went 2 seasons, and they flew us to Paris, so we knew that they were going to be promoting it. But it's still the same problems. You've got to write a character Bible for everybody, and you just know that anything, as good as it can be, some of the most fun stuff we've done, Campus Cops, for Universal, was just a blast, and it was gone after the first season. So you can't assume that there's something about it that's going to make it memorable, and it's going to be that great memory. I mean, we did an interview the other day with someone who had seen them all so many times, and he asked a question about a specific episode, like in the scene in Grumpy Old Man, when the guy has the line behind the counter. Neither of us could remember the episode.
Yeah.
Because we probably wrote it in a day or a day and a half.
Sure.
Did a quick rewrite on it, and we wrote maybe 3 or 4 of them that week if we could. And it was a while ago.
Sure.
And so now, if I'm at a party and someone says, "Oh, my daughter's, she's 21 and she used to love cartoons," I say, "Okay, so you're 21. Okay, so you were 7," and then I can peg it and say, "Oh, did you ever watch Casper's Scare School on Cartoon Central?" "Oh yeah, I love that." So they were all the same to us.
Sure.
And even now and then, someone will say that, "Oh my God, you guys were on." A is for awesome. I go, "Oh, you guys were on League of Super Evil?" And it's like, "Yeah, you saw that? Of course I saw that. I saw every episode of that." It's like, "Oh, wow. No one's ever mentioned that."
I want to say, Andrew, thank you so much for doing this. This has been a great treat. I want to end with this last thing called the one word challenge. So, when tells us this is out, thought a few names of people, places, or things that have some connection to my guest, and they have to do their best to say a word or two or sentence that comes to mind when they hear it. So, if you're ready, I'll say the words.
Okay. Hope the old memorizer is working. Go ahead.
First one, Ontario.
Never heard of it. Lakes.
Los Angeles.
No lakes.
Writing.
I should have said the Lakers. See?
Yeah.
Writing. Andrew. I just feel like a writer. That's what I am.
Animation.
Restrictions.
Hard work.
Daily.
Success.
Bitch goddess.
Johnny Carson.
Best ever.
Darryl Vickers.
Best ever.
And last but certainly never least in this cosmic universe called Earth that we live in, Andrew Nicholls.
Who? No, I would leave it at who? We're being inducted into the Walk of Fame for our hometown in a couple of weeks, and that's what I expect people there at the chicken to be saying. Who? I still see myself largely from the outside, and I still see myself as a kid walking through a snowdrift trying to think of a joke that has the word alligator in it. So who I think is a good position to be in, as long as you don't, as long as you're not in the who, then you'd be, it's pretty good. It's pretty good to be anonymous. It's a pretty good life as a writer. You can still, when you're at your peak, get a good restaurant table, but nobody recognizes you.
Well, I'm sure you're still looking for that next quality joke that you're looking for in your career. I want to say, Andrew, thank you so much for taking the time to do this. It was certainly a great treat for someone like myself who didn't grow up with the Carson Show, besides the other ones that came up afterwards. This is always a great treat to talk to those who had a significant influence on society. Whether they want to admit to it or not is another thing. I know you have a website, social media of that aspect. Where can we find stuff that you'll be working on in the future, or current information on what you're doing?
Probably some of that would be on the website, because I sometimes put things up before they're sold, or I put things up that amuses me that I tried to sell them, and that would be at andrewnicholswrites.com. Other than that, I don't know, watch the skies. As they said at the end of Invasion of the Body Snatchers.
Sure. Now, I was just going to say something. Oh, books. You wrote a book. You wrote 2 books. One that was about writing comedy, but also your sort of stories in your career and experiences. Where can they find those?
Valuable Lessons, which is a warning about writing for television. And I have had people read it and say, "Well, that talked me out of that." Was a 2010 ebook, and it's still up, and it still sells a few copies every month. It's a chronological history of our careers, telling how much we made from every show. and what the problems were with it, and usually why it got canceled. And then the second book, which is aimed at being more helpful, is based on a class I taught on writing comedy at the University of California at Davis. It's called Comedy Writer, and it's just about the habits of mind and the practices and techniques of doing that thing. And they're available on Amazon, paperback, download.
Buy them now, because you're gonna say download. Holy crap, I should bought that. But if you enjoy this episode, because who the hell wouldn't? And down the line, as my guest just said, he get inducted into the Walk of Fame. When he gets inducted into the Writers Hall of Fame in the United States, not just California, you're gonna say, "Holy shit, I should have subscribed." So subscribe, comment, share, all that fun jazz, because it's gonna help not just the algorithm, as they're all supposed to say, but also helps continue to do this fun thing that it is. Follow on social media, Nolan Car at Night Show on Instagram, I think, and Twitter, Nolan Car at Night. And the words of this guy's former boss, a little known man named Johnny Carson, I bid you all a heartfelt good night. Till next time when we speak again.